Well, time is running out for Ukraine's vaunted counteroffensive. Those are the words of General Mark Milley, as President Zelensky says Russia has basically stopped anything that NATO has been throwing at them, sort of admitting really that they really haven't made much of an advancement at all. In other words, this counteroffensive has been a total failure. That's, you don't need to mince words about it. Let's bring in Colonel Douglas MacGregor to get some analysis on this. And Colonel, good to see you. Putin says today in this kind of big speech that everyone's talking about that Ukraine has lost 71,000 soldiers during this counteroffensive that achieved nothing. What do you make of that? 71,000 soldiers killed just during the counteroffensive on the Ukrainian side. Do those numbers sound accurate to you?
Well, they're certainly plausible because about 4 weeks ago, literally a month ago, we counted over 60,000 dead. And that's based on satellite photography, looking at bodies lying on the ground, looking at cemeteries that are filling up, and also receiving reports from on the ground inside Ukraine about the masses of dead and horribly wounded people. So I think it's plausible. Can I confirm it? I can't. But I would say that the Russians have been far, far closer to the truth when they report casualties than the Ukrainians have.
General Mark Milley is saying that this time is running out here. He basically says that we've seen some gains, or some good progress here. And he said, I said at the very beginning of this that this was going to be long, slow, hard, high casualty producing. That's exactly what it is. But he thinks that there's confidence. He has a lot of confidence that, Ukraine is going to break through in the next 45 days or so before the bad weather sets in. What do you make of Mark Milley's comments?
Well, setting aside whether or not anybody wants to listen to Mark Milley, I haven't heard the truth from that man's mouth for years. He's the ultimate political puppet. And that's, of course, what the current swamp administration in Washington wants. Someone who goes along, questions nothing, and supports the status quo. Milley is a fraud, so I would just forget anything he says. The truth of the matter is as follows. The counteroffensive has been a catastrophe. Whether it's 71,000 or 69,000, I don't know. It doesn't make any difference. The equipment losses are horrendous. And all of this is for various reasons. Number one, Ukrainian forces are trained to fight like NATO. NATO, and especially the United States Armed Forces, are organized to refight some version of World War II. And we're up against a 21st century military establishment, which is organized very differently. And no one has been willing to accept this reality. And that's the biggest problem. Right now, you have persistent surveillance all over Ukraine, from space-based assets down to terrestrial assets that allow the Russians, through their intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets, to see everything in Ukraine all of the time. We have not disrupted their satellite-based capabilities for the simple reason that if we do that, they will destroy ours. We don't want to lose ours. So it's been a game. We try to race information to the Ukrainians as quickly as possible that they can exploit, but they're not organized to exploit it. The Russians are simply organized in a way that maximizes the value of their strike assets. Strike assets, artillery, rockets, missiles, drones, you name it. And these are very plentiful on the Russian side. The Russians have always appreciated the criticality of maintaining large quantities of strike weapons. They've got them in practically limitless numbers. You link those to all of these overhead surveillance capabilities, and then you have an automatic warfare capability. Something moves towards your lines, something seems to be threatening. A group of Ukrainians assemble. They bring in additional equipment. It's all detected, it's targeted, and then at a time and a place that is convenient for the Russians, they are destroyed. We failed to come to terms with this reality. People say, well, this is starting to look like World War I. Well, it's much worse than World War I. In World War I, people still didn't know what was happening behind the other person's trench line. Today, the Russians know exactly what's going on in Ukraine. And they've decided to simply sit and let the Ukrainians impale themselves. The question is, how much longer do they sit? And I can tell you there are large numbers of senior officers in Moscow, senior Russian officers, and a lot of Russian political leaders who are extremely uncomfortable with Putin's determination to, for the moment, wait. Putin is being very deliberate and very cautious. People have had it in Moscow. They say, come on, President Putin, it's time to end this thing. Crush these people, get it over with. And their point is very simple. If they don't do that, their concern is that we will be tempted to do something stupid, like intervene in Western Ukraine, or simply give the Ukrainians more capability, which is, of course, what we're doing. Now, it's not going to change anything. It's not going to change the direction of the war. But the point is, if you do nothing for as long as the Russians have, in other words, simply sit behind your defenses, annihilate your enemy, as attractive as that is, people begin to wonder, well, I guess the Russians can't attack. What's wrong with them? Why don't they attack? Well, it's a deliberate decision by President Putin. He does not want a war with us. And he's afraid that if he rapidly advances on Kiev, closes the gap between his forces and the Dnieper River, that we will interpret that as threatening and suddenly intervene. I think he's wrong. I think our opportunity to intervene is over. And I think behind the scenes, the American military establishment and the other military establishments in NATO know they cannot defeat this capability which the Russians have perfected. We're still organized for a form of warfare that is anachronistic. It's called World War II.
You write a new piece in the American Conservative, a new opinion piece out called War, Money, and America's Future, Why the Uniparty Risking a War We're so ill-prepared to fight. Why is the Uniparty risking a war we're so ill-prepared to fight? And what is the NATO-U.S. strategy then? If we're bleeding Europe to death, crushing them under sanctions by trying to place these sanctions against Russia. Europe is being crushed. The United States is being crushed. We could hit double-digit interest rates on the real estate front of the United States, wages continuing to decline, and unemployment continuing to go up on the United States side. So what is Washington's proxy war endgame here? Is it to just sit and continue to funnel money and weapons into this war zone in perpetuity? Or do they actually have an end game?
Well, remember that the original purpose of this entire operation was to bleed Russia to death. No,
Right.
It was to harm their economy, wear them out, exhaust their resources. Well, that was absurd. And the opposite has happened. Our resources are being exhausted. Right now, we know, and I'm sure you saw this in the article, and this is something a lot of Americans need to understand, that the amount of money it takes us to service the debt is now equal to our defense budget, roughly $1 trillion. How much longer can you do this? And I think that's something else that Putin, who is an economist, remember the man has a doctorate in economics, he's been watching this. And I think he's been betting heavily that not only America's economy or financial system is going to go into crisis, but I think he's expecting the Europeans to simply slide into recession or depression or worse, and that will bring an end to this conflict, at which point in time he can advance without much opposition. I mean, we already know the Ukrainians have no more manpower, per se. I mean, they've turned to the European Union, they've turned to the various governments in NATO and said, we want you to repatriate military-age males from all over your countries back to the Ukraine so that we can feed them into the meat grinder and kill them as well. I don't know how that's going to turn out. I was really depressed when I discovered that the Irish Republic had agreed to do it. But I think in Poland and other countries, there's a reluctance to do that because they feel they may face armed opposition inside their own countries from Ukrainians that say, no, I'm not going back. I'm not prepared to die. So I think we've already hit the end game. The question is, as you put it, what are we going to do? And Newland and Blinken apparently flew off recently and said, oh, let's freeze the conflict. Well, that's a non-starter. The Russians have been telling us for months, forget it. They're not going to do that.
What does that mean, freeze the conflict? What does that entail?
Well, I think what they believe it entails is something like a divided Korea, that you come to some sort of agreement along the line of contact and you say, we'll stay on this side, you stay on that side. They see it in the West, particularly in Washington, as a face-saving measure. The Russians aren't going to do it. What the Russians will not accept is any Ukrainian state of any kind that is aligned with NATO. Number one, can't happen.
Right.
Otherwise, they fought this war for no purpose. Remember, this is all about the existential threat that we present inside Ukraine to Russia. So that's out of the question. And the issue is, how do you turn to the Russians if you're in Washington in front of the American people and in front of your allies and say, look, we were wrong. You aren't weak. And we've got serious problems at home. We've got to pack it in, go home and take care of our own problems. Well, in their minds, they've just been defeated. They've admitted that they have to surrender and walk away. So in Washington, to get back to your original question, what are you going to do? You just double down and continue to do the stupid things that have failed utterly to produce any success. So send them more ATACMS missiles, send them German Taurus missiles, send whatever somebody else has got out there, especially since you know they don't have any troops to speak of. So send them long-range attack weapons that only require a few trained people, and then let them launch them to their heart's content at the Russians. And of course, again, they're going to attack Russian civilians in Russian towns and cities. We know that. They've done that before. This is insane. This is crazy, but that's where we are.
I'll get you out of here on this, Colonel, which is, again, this 45-day weather window that General Milley mentioned, 30 to 45 days or so. What happens, do you believe, in this 45 days on the Russian side? And what happens after that 45-day window closes?
Well, that's the question that none of us can actually answer to our satisfaction. And that's what I said at the beginning. I was talking to some friends in Europe that just returned from Moscow, and they're very well connected. They're actually in the journalistic community, and they said that in talking to senior Russian officials as well as senior military men on the general staff, the Russian attitude is, look, let's get this over with. Please, President Putin, let us attack. They've got 300,000 troops in reserve. It's not as though they don't have the capability to launch. And again, President Putin has chosen to wait. I think he truly believes that the situation in Europe will get so bad that NATO will simply crumble. People will simply say, well, we followed you as far as we can, Washington, and you've led us down the path to hell. Germany is being deindustrialized. One of the leading CEOs of one of the biggest chemical companies in Germany, and remember, these are industries that lead the world in many capabilities, has said, it's over. We're shutting down. We're being deindustrialized. So I think Putin has said, well, why don't we wait for Europeans to wake up, French and Germans particularly? But there is a fight in Moscow. It's not a fight in the sense that we would understand it, where people are yelling and screaming at each other. But behind the scenes, there is a big debate. Why wait? Let's get it over with. And Putin has been reluctant to do that for the reasons that we've outlined. So nobody really knows the answer at this point to your question.
If you were in a bizarro world, if you happened to be an advisor to President Putin, if it were, again, a bizarro world or an alternative dimension, and you were giving advice to Putin whether to sit back and wait, watch Europe crumble, the United States crumble, or to take action and launch these 300,000, what would you do as a military advisor?
Well, a lot of people ask me that question. I don't care to go to jail as a traitor to the American people. So I'm not going to advise President Putin, plus the fact he's done pretty well. I mean, the Russian casualties have been very low. His force is in excellent shape. He's coming out of this smelling like a rose. So I really think it's up to him. And he hasn't done badly. He's done very, very well. We're the ones who are in serious trouble. And the real issue is, what do we do? We've talked in the past about the border. The border is open. We don't know who's coming in there. Millions of people are pouring in. They're not an asset to us. They're going to be a burden to us. It's only a question of how much longer before we have an explosion inside the United States. I'm sure that President Putin is aware of that as well. So the situation in the West is terrible. And under those circumstances, it may be prudent for him to do what he's done, but he does have pressure on him. I can't advise him. And I imagine there are a lot of people that say, well, I'd like Putin to do X, but he's done pretty well thus far. And so I probably want to shut up and color until something goes horribly wrong, but I don't think it will.
I said I was going to get you out of here on that last question, but I will on this one. You see Europe now getting letters from the Ukrainian government or people in different European countries now, as you mentioned, parts of Ireland, of course. We've seen this, I think, now in Italy, and there's other countries that, of course, are also stepping up, saying they're going to repatriate these Ukrainians who have sought refuge there, send them back to the meat grinder. Do you think, now remember, the United States had given preferential treatment to Ukrainian refugees coming across the border. In fact, we know firsthand, in fact, that there were people that were waiting to move into the United States, or sitting, waiting, and Ukrainians got front of the line status to be able to come into the United States. Do you think there's a chance in hell that the United States would repatriate, send these young Ukrainian men back to Ukraine to fight?
I think it's unlikely. I mean, let's be frank, we can't even enforce our own laws. We aren't defending our own borders. We are not expelling illegals. We're not taking action against hardened criminals that are raping and murdering in our major cities. So what are we going to do? I think we're going to do exactly what the Biden administration has done, nothing. So I don't see us playing in this. Now, the Europeans have got to ask themselves whether or not they want to be war criminals, because they're essentially rounding up people and sending them back to die. This has no chance of success, and that's the point in the article. We are organized for the past. This is a different form of warfare. We can't overcome it at the moment. The smart thing to do when you realize you're up against something fundamentally new that you haven't seen before and don't know how to defeat is to fall back, reconsider, find a different way forward, and then re-engage at some future point in time. But there is no reason in this administration. There's no rationality. Everything is out of control. We are a runaway locomotive headed down the side of a mountain to absolute certain destruction. We see it on the financial side, the economic side, the human side here inside the United States. It's true for Western Europe. Under those circumstances, it's back to Putin. Why should he act if we're doing a fine job of destroying ourselves?
Yeah, great point.